He's a part-time instructor at the Laguna College of Art and Design in Laguna Beach. He's also been involved in museum administration, publishing, and he has a book that he'll tell you about that many of you already know about. And he's also a fine art artist and is involved in studio production and exhibition. So he's an all-around artist. He holds a PhD from Claremont College, Graduate University, and is a graduate of the University of Iowa with both Masters of Arts and Masters of Fine Arts degrees. Today, we are privileged to hear him speak about 5 great women artists of the 19th and 20th century. Mary Cassatt, let's see if I can pronounce this correctly, Kathy Kollwitz, Paula Manderson-Becker, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Helen Frankenthaler. Please help me welcome Dr. Havlicek. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Make sure that I'm in good line here for the video program. It's a pleasure to be here. We've been here for several times now and always enjoyed the OLLI. We have spoken at San Marcos and to various places, and I love the idea of the enrichment program that OLLI is all about. It's such a good program. And anyway, I just want to support it in every way that I can. We brought a few copies of my book on Van Gogh, which we're happy to say is nearly sold out. And it's been in publication for 10 years. We released it in 2010. And there's some talk about a new version of it. I hope that we can do that. My publisher's interested in doing that. But my wife, Jeannie, if she is right here, this lovely lady who makes sure my life runs like a clock. She's pretty wonderful. She will be right at the back after the talk, and you can get a copy just so that you know what the book looks like. The cover is a drawing that Toulouse-Lautrec made of Van Gogh when he was in Paris, and it's full of color illustrations. It's a book that people have really enjoyed. They say that the book itself is a work of art, and that says a lot about my publisher. And if you don't get a book today, you could round them off to $28. The 50% of the book sales go to the Endangered Children's Initiative. And I brought some free copies of a little booklet on the Endangered Children's Initiative. They're free, you can take them. You'll be very amazed at how much has been done and how much more needs to be done. It's a beautifully written book, actually, and it's illustrated with real children in various parts of the world. It tells their story. It also tells the story of saving them, and the redemptive part of it is really well worth reading about. And it relates in a way to our book on Van Gogh because we tell a more positive account of his life. It's based on the evidence that toward the end of his life he had suffered a real turnabout from some pretty erratic behavior. And the last months of his life were devoted to making amends with many people he had offended. And there's a real shift that began some years before, and we tell that story. It's one that hasn't been reported, but it's based entirely on his letters. So every comment that we made is backed up by his own words rather than the words of someone else. And so we'll leave it at that. Today I want to devote my talk to 5 women who have often not received, I think, the full attention that they deserve. I'd like to subtitle my talk today, The History of Cultural Cultivators. It's a broad way of looking at it, but part of what I want to emphasize is the important contribution these women made, not only to the history of art, but to, we would say, the freedom that women so richly deserved, and the admiration that so many of them did need and didn't always receive during their lifetime. So it's a story of making amends in some way to the history of art and to the importance of these individuals. I have the dates of the ladies up here for us to look at, because as we look at this, we're going to realize we're covering a good deal of time. We look at the top left, we realize that Mary Cassatt was born in 1844. In the middle of the 19th century. She died in 1926, the same year that Claude Monet died, by the way. and under very interesting and similar circumstances because both had lost a great deal of their vision. So there's something interesting about that. Then if we go to the next person on the top left, we see that Kathy Kollwitz was born in 1867. She died in 1945, just at the end of the Second World War, very significantly a German woman who was actually in Germany during the end of that war. It's a very interesting position that she had, and I'll be talking about her. Another woman who's hardly known by many is Paula Madison Becker, who was born in 1876 and died in 1907. She was only 31 years old when she died, not even as old as Van Gogh, who died at 37. And yet in a decade, she, like Van Gogh, accomplished some very important things. Then Georgia O'Keeffe stands out in a very singular way. She was born in 1887 and died in 1986. She was 99 years old. And she covers a whole century of American art. And in her own way, she captures the history of American art. A very interesting and important woman. And then finally, Helen Frankenthaler was born in 1928 and died in 2011, or recently. So let's go. First of all, Mary Cassatt. We could call her a domestic impressionist, although she and her style actually changed in a sense. She became something more of a post-impressionist toward the end of her life, and I'll make some comments about the difference, although it's not as important as it may seem. The Flirtation, Balcony in Sevilla, 1872, is a typical student work in a sense, but we see immediately that Mary Cassatt was a very good student. She was born in Pittsburgh in America and lived most of her life from the time she was around 27, 28 in around Paris, and was a very close friend of Edgar Degas, and participated in 4 of the important 8 Impressionist exhibitions. So she was very, very admired by the Impressionists. Degas felt that she was one of the finest draftspersons of the 19th century, and he was one of the very great drawers himself. He admired her enormously. So we see in this painting that she was influenced by Spanish painting at the beginning of her career, which was quite common. There was a strong interest in Spanish art in the Parisian salons. We had people like Manet, who made trips to Spain, was very much an admirer of people like Velázquez. And so we see that she too had a great deal of interest in that. However, around 1878, just a few years later, she shifted her gears and became much more herself. She started to portray things that meant something to her. Interestingly enough, she never had children, nor was she ever married, but her themes are almost always domestic themes. Mother and children were very common in Mary Cassatt's production. I think in a way, she used her painting to live an alternate life. And I don't mean that in a negative way, I mean in a very positive way. There's something very American about her work, even though she had acquired all of the skill of a French Impressionist. What I mean by that is there's a directness about her painting that stands out. The painting on the right, for instance, the way that this woman faces the we will say the camera, although that wasn't a camera. We'll just imagine that there was a camera there. The way that she faces out, there's an outwardness about her, and she looks quite American, in fact. She may have been an American friend of Mary Cassatt who was visiting her. And so there is a directness about her. We see that also in the painting on the left, the woman with the glasses, the binoculars, looking at an opera, very likely. So this directness comes through. It's one of the reasons that I think she was admired so much. She captures a moment in time, which the Impressionists did, but it's more of a thoughtful moment. We would say that Claude Monet was able to capture light effects in a very remarkable way. But like Renoir, Mary Cassatt was someone who was very interested in the psychology, the inner working of her subjects. And we get that sort of thoughtful quality in this particular picture. And we see this appearing in multiple ways. 5 o'clock tea, 1880. Simple painting. If we asked what the subject really was, it would have to be conversation and togetherness. There's nothing overtly dramatic about it, but when we study the picture, we realize it's beautifully composed. The way that she skillfully painted the silver teapot and so on, the way that she captured the light on the fireplace, all of this shows a highly developed skill and ability to render material, surface. And she was a highly observant person. And I think the reason that her paintings sold well, and yes, she was not a starving artist, she came from a prosperous and wealthy Pittsburgh family and sold her work very readily. So she was not someone who ever suffered in any way. She had a beautiful villa, very much like Monet himself did, and lived a very good lifestyle. But her concern seemed to be producing work that had a reflective, almost inward quality. Woman in Black, 1883. It opens to a lot of mystery. We wonder who she was, where she was, what she was doing. A lot of those questions are just left for us to ponder, which is an indication that she was a very great painter, able to bring us into a silent drama. That's not an easy thing to do. It's been said that Leo Tolstoy could write in such a way that a servant could come into a room. We weren't even quite sure what the servant was doing, but we already felt that we could see that servant through just the way that Tolstoy set it up. And Mary had this skill, this intuitive skill about, we would say, setting a stage for her figures. It's also very beautiful the way she would also use fabric. Almost every one of her paintings, there will be a pattern of fabric. Cézanne did this too. Many of Cézanne's paintings have a bit of fabric against the figure, and he'll have playing these things off of each other. Here we see a young girl arranging her hair, and we're moving through time. We're moving further and further from her beginnings in the 1870s. By 1886, there was an openness to explore different age groups. The fact that she would take this rather awkward-looking girl with a long neck in a white dressing gown and set her again against this fabric background. There's something really powerful about the way that she's dramatically set this. I would argue again that this is almost an American quality. And if you press me about Americanisms, I would say there's a directness about American life. If you want to get a good glimpse of it, just watch this Ken Burns series on the country music drama that's on PBS. You'll get a sense of that. There's a quality about country music that is unvarnished and direct and from the heart. And I think Mary's work has this quality. You're going to find out that also George O'Keeffe's work has some of that quality too, much of that. So as we move along, we're going to see that I'm going to show you 3 Americans and 2 German artists who share some differences, and that difference is worth noting. Here again we see now Mary turning to a theme that she became very well known for, the mother and child of 1890. 1890 is the year that Van Gogh died at the age of 37, and Mary's career would span a much longer period of time to the last 10 years of her life when she became virtually blind, was able to travel, but continued to have a very strong influence on art in the world, and I'll explain how that happened. Again, what's interesting about this one is that instead of using drapery and a background to set this sort of figure drapery study, she uses the pattern of the woman's dress to create that activity, and then she slows everything down by leaving parts of the picture virtually, we would say unfinished, but deliberately. If you look on the back, just behind the little child's head to the right, there is a plate or a dish that's scumbled in. And parts of the lower section of the painting here, for instance, haven't even been filled in. And we don't seem to be troubled by that at all. She would say, we have an imagination, we can fill that in visually through our own imagination, and leaving parts of pictures like this for the viewer to participate in would be like a crossword puzzle, allowing you to put in some of your own information. And that is a signature style that evolved of actually leaving openings for a viewer into a work. It shows that you see that your viewer is intelligent and it can able put 2 and 2 together. And that quality of a slightly unfinished work was something we find in Degas and other members of the Impressionist group as well. Another thing that's really interesting about America Sat is she took up printmaking, being heavily influenced by Japanese prints that she had seen, wood block prints and so on. And she developed a very interesting hybrid style of using sugar lift, dry etching, and other kinds of engraving techniques to produce a whole series of these beautiful prints that really did capture the interest of the Impressionists. They thought they were absolutely beautiful, and very few artists had produced anything quite like them. It set her apart. And again, we see her using the domestic themes of everyday life, a woman washing on the left, and two ladies having afternoon tea again on the right, and etching an aquatint combination, very beautiful, simple works with simple, strong colored segments that was very typical of what was happening within what was called post-impressionism. Post-impressionism, for me, was exemplified by people like Gauguin, Paul Gauguin, Cézanne, Van Gogh too, to some degree, and there's a greater solidity of form. There's less of the sketchiness that we associate with Impressionism. It's as though the forms themselves take on a solidity, and we see that, for instance, in this picture, the bath, which is really quite finished. There's no open, unfinished sections. She wanted to push this painting to a very tight finish, and it has it. It's a gorgeous painting. It's wonderful, for instance, the way that the little girl's foot is clearly in the water, and we see the difference of the transparency where the foot is covered by water. But again, it's set up with this vase and the lower section with a little bit of a design on it. And again, this designed background that surrounds the figure. And this dress, you may have seen it before because it appears in this picture too. Same dress. So using the staging that a good stage designer would use, she knows when to bring her fabrics into play and just how far to take it. Toward the end of her life, we're approaching that. We're now in the late mid-1890s. Her eyesight begins to fail. But what's noticeable about these late pictures is their strong, solid form and the fact that they seem to be heavy and weighty. This is, again, a very unusual view to be looking over the shoulder of a boat rower out in the water. She had certainly seen Monet's paintings. She knew Monet. She had participated in 4 shows, so they had plenty of opportunities to talk. And we start to see the influence of artists who are using boats and boat scenes. Monet liked to paint from a boat. We have other artists who produced work, so did Manet and many others, and boating became a very popular activity in France and throughout the world at this time. This is the last oil painting that we can attribute to her. It was completed in 1904. By then, her eyesight is growing worse and worse, and for the next many years of her life, she produced very little art. But she did travel, and she came increasingly to the United States. What many people don't know is that she was asked to select many of the works that are now in the Chicago Art Institute, personally finding them, paintings by El Greco, important Impressionist paintings, and so on. So she had a great stake in the cultural edification of the United States. She didn't care so much whether her work was in that collection in Chicago. It probably already was, because her works had been very well distributed throughout the world. But she started to take on the role of cultivating American culture by bringing some great paintings into the United States. And people trusted her eye. She had a great eye for high quality in other artists, Spanish artists, and so on. And so if you visit the Chicago Art Institute, which has a tremendous collection, you can, in a way, salute her, because she was someone who was very, very concerned about bringing great art and art education to America. She would have appreciated OLLI, I think. She was someone who had a long-term and long-range interest in the well-being of her country. She felt that her country had given her a great deal and never lost her love for her American background. Now, shifting gears, we look at Katha Kollwitz. We see that she was 78 years old when she passed away. She lived a long and difficult life, as I'll explain to you. Her work does not have the intimacy of Mary Cassatt. She's a woman who was exposed to a revolution. She lost both a son and a grandson in war. Her own son died in World War I, and her grandson died in World War II. She was also married to a doctor who volunteered his services to the absolute abject poor in Berlin, people who could not afford health care. And so she worked as a nurse and kept very active in providing as much as she could to others. Her early work shows of revolutionary interest. She was at one time a communist, at least in mind. Although she visited Soviet Russia in 1927, it changed her view entirely. And then being swept up within Nazism and being ousted from her position by Hitler changed a lot of her views of both extremism and totalitarianism of various sorts. The March of the Weavers is a social revolt. We see the uprising of 1899. Again, it's a theme of people taking power into their own hands and involved in revolution. These are prints. She's someone who did not use a great deal of color in her work. We don't find the colorism of someone like Mary Cassatt. We have a somber, focused, political mindset in many ways, although the subject of children and so on meant a great deal to her, but in a very different way. We see a woman with a dead child. It's a charcoal drawing that she completed in 1903. She was not someone afraid of showing death because she saw a great deal of it as a nurse in Berlin, in the poorest section, working with her husband. And so as the time went on, she turned her attention increasingly to the working class, head of a working class woman in blue shawl, lithographs and so on. A somber, focused interest in even the more tragic aspects of human life. But there's something deeply touching about it. And I have been watching the bluegrass movement and all of the Americanisms of the Ken Burns series, and it's on my mind right now. I recognize things like the Appalachian poor and all of that. We could connect with that in our own way, having lived through a century of American life, and you see that very well in the Ken Burns series. And these are people that country western singers might have sung about. I'm a daughter of a miner, etc. What is the song? Coal Miner's Daughter. Yeah, that could be a coal miner's daughter there on the right. We see this kind of seriousness in her own etchings and drawings and self-portraits, often lithographs, very little color in her work, and very little joy in her work too. And that doesn't make her less important. She's someone who really put her finger on the danger of war, and she became a pacifist as a result, which put her in very bad standing with Adolf Hitler. She was appointed to the Academy in 1919. She was there as the first female instructor, and Hitler took her from her job in 1933 and banished her, forced her to live in a rural district, and forbade her to exhibit her work. The irony was that the Nazis actually took many of her lithographs, took her name off of them, and used them for propaganda purposes without her permission. So there's an irony about all of this. And self-portrait shows of 1924 a woodcut, a very traditional device, very common really throughout the 19th century, and she was someone who could use this. There's an amazing force about the fact that she's working in black and white. We would say black and white is really probably the signature language of life and death. And that's for one reason that police cars are black and white. And we see that kind of extreme quality. The Mothers of 1925 is a woodcut showing all of these mothers trying to protect children. We see a little child hiding here, trying to shield them from the danger that was happening as a result of both World War I and World War II, which she lived through both of those wars. This is probably one of the happiest set of images that I can find in her work. Both of them are lithos. The one on the left produced in 1930 and the one on the right in 1916, a mother with child. Now here's something that Mary Cassatt would have appreciated about her in this case. But it shows that she understood the the joy of having children and the joy of sharing that, but she also knew the loss of what happens when families are destroyed through war and through all of the suffering that is caused by it. And so we'll end on just this note. By the end of 1945 rather, and the end of the Second World War, she had seen that. She knew that the war had ended. And the fact that she was in an outer area away from Berlin probably meant that her life was spared from a lot of the bombing and fighting that occurred in Berlin itself. Her work now is looked upon as one of the great hearts of the history of art, because this is a woman who had very little, I would say, commercial success, but she had a great deal of, we would say, admiration from people who saw the heart of her work, something like an unsung country western singer. And I don't mind making that analogy, because there is a connection there with these sort of grassroots. And it takes, I think, a special person to produce work like that in a selfless way, wanting to serve others. She said at the end of her life, I want people to know that there was a sympathetic heart that could understand your pain and suffering, and I hope I could have alleviated some of that. It's a very beautiful thing to say. She wanted that to be a tribute. Paula Modersohn-Becker is also German. She shares many of the themes of Kathy Kollwitz. She died at the age of 31 in 1907, and the reality was that her early work showed a great deal of interest in her own inner life. She said that above all, my work will probably be about someone who has a very personal way of looking at things, and someone who hopes that others realize that there's a sympathetic heart. Many of her works show somber children with wide eyes looking out. I think many of these were at least emotional self-portraits of herself as a young child. She was living in basically a commune, and I need to use that very carefully, something like the communes that were the case in the 60s, but in America, but in Germany, it was more of a social community where people were married and so on. And she had married a man named Modersohn. Her last name was actually originally Becker. Her maiden name actually was at the end of the name rather than the middle, as we're used to. And we see children here with garlands and flowers and so on. And there's something very heart-wrenching about the way that the little girl on the right looks out. A little girl with a pendulum. I find that interesting in itself because a pendulum suggests time, some kind of inevitable sweep and movement of time, and as though she could be dealing with that. As it turns out, she was, because one of the things she always wanted to do was to be a mother. That seemed to be a great deal to her. And Head of a Little Girl at a Window in 1902, Girl in a Landscape 1901, children sort of looking straight out, and the sort of dark background, there's a very quiet, somber quality that would be similar in some way to Kathy Kollwitz as well. And so we see that connection, living through very difficult, troubled times. 1904, Old Woman Sitting with a Cat, Old Peasant Woman, 1905. These are not pictures that you probably would want to put up on your wall. They're somber, they're probing, they have depth. She was very deeply moved by Van Gogh's work. She had gone to Paris 3 times to see the work of Van Gogh and also the work of Gauguin. A certain monumentality appears right here around 1905. She eliminates all the extraneous, and it gets us down to just a powerful, solid presence of an individual, almost sculptural. These portraits become very interesting. There's a self-portrait on the right, 1906. She's going to live 1 more year. And so she's looking out. She is now pregnant around this time. And she achieved something that she always had wanted. She wanted to have a child. She did. And her joy lasted for 3 weeks. And she died of a heart attack. She was always in ill health. The childbirth and so on took more out of her than she could sustain. But before she died, she made these great monumental paintings of a mother and child that seemed to signify much more than a personal view of them. They are universal, mothers and children. They stand for all mothers and children, not unlike Kathy Kowitz's gathering, standing for all of us who understand what it is to be a child or having children or caring about a community. There's something very powerful and important about that kind of message where art history goes beyond itself. It's no longer about style and where someone fits into a history per se. It's something more timeless. Timeless themes like this, taken up by artists who really don't care whether they are commercially successful, is a surprise to us. She sold very few works in her life, only a handful. And Van Gogh, too, sold a handful. More than one, by the way. People say Van Gogh sold only one work. I could prove to you that he sold several works. But the proof was that he exchanged them and did some other things, so they weren't typical sales, but they were sales nonetheless. So when we look really at what this woman did, we see this strong, simple form. It's strange in a way that she would darken the face of this figure. And I think that's intentional. She, in a way, wanted to say, this is beyond race, that we all share common blood, whatever skin color we have. She had a very keen interest in racism, and I'm talking about the flip side of it. She wanted to show that racism was a kind of fallacy, that there was a great danger in assigning value to someone by skin color, something that we are hearing a great deal about in our own time. But she was someone already attuned to that as early as 1907 and even earlier. So when we think of these great monumental paintings of her, and we think of Kathy Kowitz, we think of two women who brought their own love of humankind into a family setting and gave us all something really timeless, something beyond so-called style, if you will. So suddenly we see Georgia O'Keeffe. Jeannie and I had the opportunity to actually stand right in this area of the house, standing right in front of those antlers and so on, took a tour of the house in Abiquiu, got a real sense of just who this woman was. She was a very formidable woman who had suffered a great deal in her own right. And so she had been through a lot too. Georgia's 99 years were full of periods where she was separated from her husband who was unfaithful to her. There were other periods of time where she was hospitalized when she realized the full weight of his infidelity. She was hospitalized for several weeks, possibly a month or two, for a type of nervous breakdown. She recovered from all of that and found nature to be a tremendous source of solace for her, and began spending increasing amounts of time in Santa Fe, in desert areas of New Mexico and other places. And she turned the landscape into something that was very sacred to her and brought to all of us something very special about the beauty of America and her admiration for it. Her career took off in the 1920s with paintings of flowers, although she continued to have a very strong interest in just simple monumental forms all of her life, as we see in things like Black Mesa Landscape of 1930, or if we look back to Trees in Autumn and Skunk Cabbage. These are all paintings that had to do with celebrating natural form. We see blue, black, and gray, but it could easily be a waterfall and a side tributary with clouds. There's a monumental quality that she had about her work that's not unlike Paula Madison Becker or even Kathy Kowitz, simplifying a simple form and finding a whole world within it. She was capable of doing that. And although her pictures are certainly far more colorful than Madison Becker or Kathy Kowitz, there is an energy about them, almost a surreal quality in the sense of looking into a flower as though it could be a world in its own right. That takes a very special vision. But she begins to turn this vision increasingly to the mountains in areas of Santa Fe and beyond, Black Mesa Landscape of 1930. We see her concentrating and simplifying the structures of these mountains and the grasses and so on, creating beautiful, stylized, simplified, spiritual landscapes, really, partly imagined, but partly perceived, because she did like to work from nature. Black of Marie's has reference to the back of someone's home. Marie was one of her friends. In 1931, again in oil, these very interesting, well-designed pictures that show her interest in Japanese art, which she had taught. She had taught art in Texas. She was very interested in certain theories having to do with design. A strong design simplifies and eliminates the extraneous. It's something we saw in both Kathy Kowitz and Madison Becker as well. Pink shells, clam shells, mussels, she can turn her vision almost to anything and find a whole world inside of it. I think it's quite beautiful the way that this shell is something like a sunburst. We almost can see the sun here and the rays coming out of it. So we can read it in multiple ways. Yes, it's a clam, but it also is a whole world in itself. And it's that vision that she had that makes her work very special, very unique. Bear Lake, New Mexico, it's an unusual format, this strong way that it rises up as a strong vertical. It's echoed here again in Autumn Trees, the maple of 1924. She's taking the elements of art and bringing it to us in a way that forces us to see it in a fresh, new way. We would say that she's bringing fresh vision to us. We might say that Kathy Kowitz and Madison Becker brought to us a concern for one another. There's a tender kind of concern for humankind. Georgia O'Keeffe is taking us into nature and reminding us that it saved her life, that it was that immersion in nature that revitalized her. So she's celebrating it again and again. So we'd say she's a cultural cultivator in the sense of reminding us of things of value. And I do think that the arts are far more important than we realize. If we look only into the history and the evolution of art, we're overlooking something very important. And that would be its purpose in the first place. And one of the strongest arguments in favor of art is that it connects people. It's a bridge. As the country western singers kept saying, it doesn't matter how you sing, what's important is that you sing from the heart and people respond to that, because we all connect in that way, the heart connection. She's probably best known for some of these ram's heads and blue morning glories, this idea of just having a form as simple as a skeletal figure hovering in the air and putting a morning glory next to it is a very curious thing. I would say it's a dialogue between life and death. I would say it brings up very important eternal themes. It raises questions about eternal life, which she was very interested in and had solved that for herself. She was a believer. She believed in God. And she had a form of Christianity. And paintings like this had the quality of a resurrection theme. There is about them, we would say, a religious implication, but with not overt religious imagery, if you will. We would say spiritual imagery. Untitled Red and Yellow Cliffs of 1940, we see her just rising these beautiful cliffs up and finding this terrific range of colors in them. As we were traveling in this area ourselves in Abiquiu and all that, we saw that she was very sensitive to this environment, and those colors are absolutely in the landscapes. In the same way that someone like Mary Cassatt liked to find pattern to place in background positions in her paintings. So Georgia found her patterns in nature, and nature's not short of any patterns, believe me. There's just no end to it. My Front Yard in summer 1941 is a tribute to the fact that she had a beautiful home with a large window that she could look out at, enjoy the seasonal change. And as we were walking around there, I had an opportunity to take this photograph from her backyard. And in the distance, we see the mountain, so on. But the thing that's notable about her is that if there was a mountain, she'd always rise the horizon line, so that when we see the mountain, it takes on a real writhing form. She would have probably learned that from Cézanne, who often painted Mount Sainte-Victoire in his pictures, and the mountain always took a very top-end position in these paintings, so that you had the feeling it was rising way above us. And I think in a way, she deliberately would lift the horizon line up here, so that we're forced to look at it and probably eliminate a highway. So if she were to paint this, this is probably what she would have given us. But she would say, I'm concentrating on the obvious and I'm eliminating the extraneous, something that Van Gogh was quoted as saying. I always thought that was a very good thing to say, because what a good artist does is teach us to see something in a fresh way. It's one thing to copy an object. In high school, the thing to do, the thing you want to be able to do is copy a photograph and have people say about your drawings, it looks like a photograph. Well, someone like Georgia O'Keeffe wouldn't have considered that a compliment at all. She said, I'd rather not that it not look like a photograph, I'd rather it looks like a painting and one that I made. And not to be confused with the photograph, because a photograph can be taken by anyone, but a very great one would be taken by Ansel Adams. But nonetheless, there is a quality about the photograph that's a little less personal than an artist's personal touch. And that personal touch was very important to her, always. When we visited the home and studio, I was very interested in seeing more about her mindset, because I knew that she had a very strong health orientation, which she did. And when we were given the tour by the house, we were taken into a sublet of her kitchen, which had large freezers in it. And I was very interested in the fact that the walls were covered with mason jars. She produced all of her own food in a large garden that she had very carefully irrigated, figured out a way to bring a spring down through the city. And what was really sweet about her is that she shared the water with the individuals in that city who needed a water supply. And then a small tributary of it came into her garden so that she could grow fruit trees, vegetables, and so on. She seemed to have been a vegetarian, and she wanted to eat her own produce year-round. She also was very much of a fanatic about her connoisseurship, and she left very specific records of every painting she made, the pigments that she used, the paint layers, the varnishes, etc., so that if the picture ever needed to be restored, a museum curator would have a field day. They would know exactly what to do. She altered all of her own brushes. She liked to have them angled, so she would take a pair of scissors and take a bristle brush and cut it in an angle so it had a sharp point on it. She could make very precise movements and motions with it. So what you got from her was a very interesting woman who became a cultural icon in the 60s, because she was already an earth mother in a sense without being a part of any of that. And so there was a cult of people who would want to visit her, and I think it made her increasingly want to make sure that they didn't just visit her at any time. So she began to move around so that people couldn't just drop in on her. Interestingly enough, go ahead. She had an eyesight problem in the last 10 years of her life too, and turned to ceramic. So there's a parallel between her and Mary Cassatt. Both of them lost their vision in the last years of their life. Well, we're moving on to one of the last people in the talk today, and we're on target, and we'll have some time for Q&A as well. So I'm hoping you'll have some questions as well. The last person I want to talk to about today, excuse me, take a drink of water. This reminds me of some political situation where someone reached for a bottle of water. Helen Frankenthaler, we will call her a lyrical abstractionist. Excuse me. She's someone who was very aware of Georgia O'Keeffe, but she was also someone very much aware of current traditions that were developing in New York. Painters like Morris Louis, Mark Rothko, and many others who were starting to stain canvas. It was a very direct way of working with the surface of a painting and achieving effects that were very much like watercolor on a large scale. So there wasn't anything necessarily new about staining sheets of paper or canvas that had been done before, but what was unique about it was the scale of which these pictures were made. They were very large scale paintings, and she was a very diminutive woman. She lived to 2011, so she's someone who had a very interesting history in her own right. To give you some idea of how big her pictures are, this will set the scale. We see her walking in bare feet on the floor, and her paintings are unfurled on the ground before they would ever be stretched. She would be working on large unstretched pieces of canvas that she could soak with Magna paint, which was a kind of early precursor to acrylic, and then she worked entirely in acrylic from 1960 onward. And she was able to create beautiful floating effects and other things that make the pictures very, very atmospheric. Often the pictures do have references to nature. She was a swimmer. She loved nature and made a number of pictures that seemed to be tributes to her favorite swimming sites. Blue Atmosphere on the left, in 1963 is an acrylic picture. We can sense something like clouds floating in the background, this uprising of shapes that seem to just float there in either the water or the sky. We definitely get the feeling of clouds within some kind of structured format. Buddha's Court has rather a mysterious title. But what we see is there in these pictures is a framing, a great sensitivity to simple shapes, a monumentality of scale, and the feeling that the paintings themselves could allow us to journey into them, very much like we could journey into those unfilled sections of the Mary Cassatt paintings, inviting someone to use their imagination to contemplate and to, in a way, soar through these pictures. Canyon, 1965. We can read this as a deep red canyon. We could read this as some type of landscape. We could read this as a horizon with just a bit of light shining through, glimpses of light perhaps shining through a cloud. They are diaphanous, they are transparent, and yet if you were to see one in the flesh, and you could see one by going to the Palm Springs Desert Museum, they have a very big painting by Helen Frankenthaler, and it's a reference to canyons as well. It fits perfectly into the landscape and terrain around Palm Desert and so on, very reminiscent of the mountains and desert there as well. So she was very much attuned to nature, and she carried that, I think, to some degree from George O'Keeffe, the idea that the landscape could be a place of refuge. And these are imaginary landscapes, to be sure, but based on real experiences that she had swimming and traveling and things of that nature. Flood, 1967. Again, we get the feeling of water filtering, moving down layer by layer into the earth, perhaps to some subterranean river or something of that nature. We could read this as clouds too. We could read it in multiple ways, but literally it is the flood of acrylic paint. So she's always being honest to the material that she's working with. And that became a very important premise of the aesthetic of the New York school, the color field school, that the media itself is a message, that the paint itself has a painterliness that we can enjoy very much as we would enjoy a tree or any other formal properties of something. Up to this time, largely paint was seen as a mediation, a step into another experience. But with the color field painters, paint itself could be enjoyed in its own right, and it could allude to other things as well. It was elusively rich, but it was also true to its own material integrity. Willie Nelson would say, I can't keep him off my mind right now, my nasalish voice is indicative of Texas. My nasalish voice, maybe not one that you like at the beginning, but I'm going to be honest with you, I'm going to like his voice. Now that I've heard it so many times, I realize there's authenticity there. And he didn't have an easy career. But we would say the media is the message with Willie Nelson. And the intonation and the quality of his voice captures a certain mood, quality of life that's as rusty and dusty as those highways and byways that the highwaymen were traveling on, to use a reference to that, if you don't mind. Movable Blue is a very big picture. It's probably 22 feet wide. And we read it as a big landscape. Light, color, water, perhaps an indication of some kind of horizon line, little bits of color that emerge from the outside and win their way into the picture. Pictures like this just lift you. And pictures like this are designed for long contemplation, like the Mark Rothko Chapel, which was designed actually as a contemplative arena. And these large works of Mark Rothko are essentially grays and blacks that just really shine out of the darkness and create an atmosphere and mood in their own right. Nature Abhors a Vacuum, 1973. Again, a very strong reference to nature itself. We see a horizon line, we see parts of landscape, perhaps a distant hill, perhaps the grass growing on a grassy hill, lighter green, shift of color. We see a darker version of a brown here, a lighter again, the color shifts into a reddish color. There's a piece of landscape here, a zip of horizon line that repeats, and it repeats itself at least 3 times. The open white becomes almost like water that works its way through here, and yet we're very aware of the edges of a contour, very much like a landscape, and we would read it as a large landscape. Keep in mind that painting would be perhaps the size of this wall. So if as we stand in front of it, it would be like standing in front of the Grand Canyon in its own way. And so we would be brought into this. Mark Rothko, who was a friend of Helen Frankenthaler, said something about large pictures. He said, a large picture is innately intimate because you're drawn into it. We often think of intimacy as something small like a jewel, but they had a very different feeling. They wanted to wrap you into the picture and bring you into it. And that, in a way, is an invitation. And there's an intimacy about the large scale that is surprising. But it had a very different intention than many people realize. But the problem was, pictures like this would not be designed for everybody's living room. Right? They were designed primarily for museums and other public spaces. So interestingly enough, many of these artists, including Mark Rothko in particular, had very strong social views. Sadly enough, Mark Rothko, whose work we could share, but we don't have the time, and he's not a woman anyway, as far as I know. He was someone who was obsessed with the Holocaust. He was much in tune with people like Kathy Kollwitz and Madison Becker, and to such a degree that it haunted him for the rest of his life. He never quite overcame it. He took his own life, as you might discover, even though he had a world-renowned career and his paintings could sell for any amounts of money. There was something more to his career than even success, and success itself still couldn't supply the yearning, the haunting that he felt that he was alive and so many people that he knew had died in those environments and so on. So it's a reminder that that intimacy can also be one that one has to wrestle with. Fortunately for Kathy Kollwitz, who also dealt with tragic themes, she was able to mitigate that by functioning as a nurse and being able to connect with individuals in a more direct way than someone like Mark Rothko. Caveat, 1973, again, strong landscape feeling. There's just no question about it. We would read this as Earth. We could read this as a great pool of water, perhaps an island floating in an Irish sea, a beautiful maroon cloud, a little zip of a distant horizon, or maybe even an outlying island. You can see things like this in Hawaii. I've lived there for a couple of years and was able to travel. And oftentimes when you're up high in, say, Maui, you could look off into the distance and see 2 more islands just floating off in the distance. And you could actually see things like this. And so there isn't anything fully imaginary about this. She was a woman who traveled a good deal. She had a very successful career. There isn't anything tragic about her life that I can think of. And her works are very uplifting and life-giving, very much like the work of Georgia O'Keeffe. So we can salute these 2 ladies for bringing a generative quality into our social discord, into, we would say, cultivating social reflection, helping us to reflect on the things that are worth thinking about, enjoying nature, enjoying the beauty of art, enjoying one another, enjoying the pleasure of attending a museum visit and things of that sort. Springbank, again, a nature reference, probably to something she actually saw because she did live near a river. And we might read this as the water that is starting to accrue around an area, perhaps water here, greenish light, We can read it in multiple ways, or maybe even a green cloud. You can read it any way you want. But what's interesting is that it is based on nature and things that she was appreciating in nature. And I'll just close off by showing some pictures that are a little more, we would say, mysterious. This one is simply entitled M. It seems to be like a vast canyon, the interior of a cave, but at the same time, it's a non-objective work that's full of a somber, kind of reflective quality. Or Morphesis of 1988, one of her last pictures that has a kind of interesting squarish quality, moving a bit away from the landscape and becoming something like a silent interior page from her own thought process. One painting that is a little more difficult to decipher, but the fact that it is entitled Morphesis suggests its forms changing, because we think of metamorphosis and we think of the idea of this as a painting that seems to be evolving from squarish shapes to something that's more amorphous with little bits of references to clouds and other things about it, but without any clear overt meaning. But we would say the meaning is the mood of the work. So anyway, we do have time for Q&A. We've got about 15, 20 minutes. We can do that. And as I said, if anyone does want a copy of the Van Gogh book, my wife Jeannie can sell it to you at the back. And just know that really one of the reasons I'm here is primarily to raise funds for the Endangered Children's Foundation. You get a great book as a result of this, and you get to also support something. I don't want to just talk about that, but that's important to me. It's important to all of us to save the lives of children. And so much of my talk really had to do with children. So there is a reason for that as well. So please, feel free to ask any question. We'll see if we can at least field it. Yes, sir.
In a general sense, when an artist works in the very large pieces and they're commissioned initially by maybe a foundation or something, do they give directives to the artist, or does the artist have a free choice? What's the standard procedure? Because those pieces, obviously, you said they're not going to hang in somebody's home.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not.
Could you maybe repeat this question?
Yeah, the question would be: is there a standard procedure in commissioning a large work like America's, let's say Georgia Helen Frankenthaler? There probably isn't. But in some cases, you wish that there were. I mean, that's an ambiguous answer, but I'll give you an example. Mark Rothko was commissioned to paint pictures for the Seagram building. And he discovered that the paintings were going to be put up essentially in a dining area. I'm not sure he was sure about it at the beginning. He had the idea that they were going to be in a workers' quarters because he had a very socialist mentality. When he found out that very wealthy people were going to be having cocktails and so on in front of these pictures that are very somber and have some of the meditations that had a lot to do with the Holocaust about them, he pulled out of the commission, wouldn't even allow the paintings to be placed there, and returned the money that he was given for that commission. There are other cases where artists have been given more directive, and there are artists who are quite willing to work with that, a color palette and so on. But I wouldn't say that there's any one particular directive, but generally speaking, when a major artist is commissioned, what a buyer wants is an authentic work by that individual. And they probably would be very happy with whatever that artist wants to produce. But I personally think there should be some give and take. I don't think there's anything wrong with an artist asking a potential buyer where the picture is going to be and responding to that. If Georgia O'Keeffe, for instance, knew that there was one of her paintings that was going to be placed in an airport, she probably would have wanted some of her paintings of clouds in there, and she did travel a lot and flew a lot and was very interested in views from the window of her plane. So she might have said, hey, look, you don't even have to commission in particular. I've got a whole series of big paintings of clouds already completed. I'll be glad to sell one to you. So often there would be happy connections that would happen like that. And of course, we've got the great story of Michelangelo, who's commissioned, right, to paint the Sistine Chapel and the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, and that didn't always go so well. Sometimes people got things that they didn't expect, like in the Last Judgment, and with a lot of nudity and so on, and then the Pope commissioned a guy to paint little cover breeches over the naked bottoms and stuff like that. And fortunately, those have been removed, but there was a period of time when Uncle Michael, we call him in the history of art, went too far, you know. So commissioning a work can be a delicate matter, you know. Yeah.
The last artist, you put up her paintings and you gave your interpretation of these vague landscapes that she was doing. Why is it that the artist doesn't give instructions with their pictures? I go to museums and yes, I could interpret it, and I'm probably interpreting it 100% different than it should be interpreted. But why is it that they never tell you what they actually were trying to do?
Well, it's another good question. I think the question is, why is it that artists don't leave us with instructions as to how to enjoy their work? I would say that it comes down to something, and again, forgive me for bringing the country western thing into this again. These artists want to communicate rather directly with you through the artwork itself. And they also believe that if the work is broadcasting a message and people spend enough time with it, they'll begin to get on the wavelength. Someone asked Mark Rothko, I think it was Rothko, how much time they should be spending with one of his works. And he said, well, it took me a month to paint this. So if you could spend at least 15 minutes, that might be a good start. And other artists have put it in other ways. I've spent my lifetime developing this point of view. Perhaps you need to slow down and let the work reveal itself to you slowly. And if you come up with more than one view on one day, that might be good, because the work may be broadcasting on more levels. And often the case would be that an artist would have to say that they're working at a range. And I'm thinking more of the painters from the New York school. We would say the less objective painters who are not painting a narrative. We don't confuse a Mark Rothko with a Norman Rockwell. We don't confuse them, but they were designed to do very different things. A Norman Rockwell is clearly there to tell a story like Mark Twain. But someone like Mark Rothko wants to evoke a mode, very much like Beethoven. So if you walk up to Beethoven and says, give me a set of instructions so that I can listen to your symphony, he might say, I'll give you a set of directives. I wrote this in response to Napoleon. I wrote this in response to the end of a war. I wrote this in response to a carriage ride, and a lot of other things. But I'm not even sure entirely what it all means. Life itself is a very rich and complicated thing, and I use my work to understand it better myself. And I would rather that someone even struggles a little bit with a work of art than to rush to judgment. And it doesn't demean anything that you've said, but I would have to say that if you're looking at a work that doesn't have an overt message, that probably the message is to get in tune with the color, get in tune with the shape language, get in tune with the mood of the work. As someone like Clement Greenberg would say, the media is partly the message, or is the message. And with the color field stained painters, they evoke an effusive, almost breathing quality. You feel as though the paintings are actually breathing out. And when you experience them, there's a release. There's a very direct quality that we would call entrainment. It's a word that's coming out of neuroaesthetic. And it means that the work is so big that it can literally affect you physically. And I'll give you an example. If you go to the ocean on a normal day and spend 20 to 25 minutes on the shore with your feet in the sand, after about 20 to 25 minutes, unbeknownst to you, your heart rate and breathing rate will be entrained by the rhythm and patterns of that water. There's many cases of this. You could take two people and put them back to back if they have normal hearts and they're working properly, and their breathing and heart rates will be entrained even unconsciously. The reason for this seems to be that at one time we were in the womb of someone, a mother. We still seem to be getting born there. And so we were hyper aware of the beating of a heart and the rhythms in an enclosed environment. And we would be entrained as a child by the mother's rhythms. So there are powerful rhythms that we experience in concerts, in nature, and so on, that will literally entrain us. And large works like that do that. Up to this time, a lot of the effect was unknown even by the artists themselves. They compared their paintings to music and other things, and they were half right. They intuitively sensed that they were communicating and connecting with another person, but they couldn't explain fully how. But now we know more about it. The shape language, the color, and the form of those works, those large works, can entrain us after a few minutes. And we can walk out of there with almost a physical experience. And that's part of the explanation that neuroscience is giving us now about the effect of music. And that's why OLLI is important, because the arts are extremely good for brain function. That strong sense of felt emotion and thoughtful reflection is a way of unifying the mind and the emotional structure. That's very good for us. Dancing, for instance, you probably have heard this. People who dance and do a lot of body motion are almost 70% less likely to ever develop Alzheimer's or a lot of the diminutive things that can happen to the brain. There's the body-mind activities seem to be so vital, and there's so much research that's coming down. If you want to watch a good program on this, go to PBS and look for the series called Art and the Mind. Art and the Mind, 2-part series, and it will talk about a lot of these recent researches in the importance of the arts for all of us, proper aging, and many, many other things. And what's cool about it is that clinical psychologists, experts on brain science are interviewed again and again in the film and talk to us. And also actors, actresses, all kinds of different people are brought into the program to talk about the benefits they have seen and received in their involvement with the arts. So that's a good one. It's a good question. But I think the arts do far more than we realize. Yes?
Medicine is now beginning to experiment with using, taking people who have cardiac rhythm disturbances and exposing them to the regularity of a heart. And the heart will pick up the rhythm of the external heart. And so they are working with that as a adjunct treatment to people who have cardiac arrhythmias.
That's beautiful. I was really turned on to even more of this entrainment when I met with some of the experts at Hoag Hospital who do brain surgery. I had an opportunity to do a lecture with them at Bowers Museum several years ago. And one of the surgeons told me about the back-to-back thing. She said, this entrainment effect is so powerful that we're only beginning to realize how simple and powerful it is. It's another reason why now we see a lot of children now being carried in the front or even by the back, the papoose, the whole thing. The Native Americans knew something very important about creating community by having the children on them, near them, for long periods of time. And some of the estrangement and difficulty that kids are having in our society right now with suicide in high school and so on is alarming. And I think a good deal of it is this lack of cohesion. A lot of it is because of, it began with television and taking our attention away from one another off in another direction and losing this vital connection and community. And the arts are designed to create community. When we talk about a culture, we're talking about cultivating groups, having all kinds of activities, having a wedding ceremony, a concert, art exhibition, culinary experiences, poetic readings. All of these things are a part of the cultivation of a culture. And some of the more interesting research on this, it continues to use the word cultivate. We have to work at it. OLLI is a cultural cultivator because you're keeping people alive and vital by dealing with important issues of learning and a lot of other things. And the artists that we seem to most admire are people like, at least for me, people like Kathy Kowitz, who had a great social concern, Mary Cassatt, who not only cared about society, she actually invested her time making sure the museums in America were filled with great works to cultivate our American culture and bring something of inner civilization into us. As a German collector said, my job is to create inner civilization, help people to feel connected to each other and connected to their community, because without that, we are outsiders, and to become an outsider is to feel alienation, and to feel alienation is to feel depression, et cetera, et cetera. It's a cycle. It's a very sad cycle that can be avoidable. And I think that's why the arts are so vital and so important, and why I think it's so important that we have discussions like this, and that we encourage the arts in high school especially. I think the sad reality is that many of the art program and musical programs and so on in high school were eliminated. That was a tremendous mistake. There were opportunities for kids 16, 15, 14 to share feelings and to talk to someone, to realize someone felt like they did, maybe develop a friendship. I had an experience where I teach at the art school. A girl told me about an experience she had in high school. She said there was a boy in her one of her classes that she felt felt estranged. He always sat at the back of the class and things like that. She said, I don't know why I was prompted to write a poem, and I hardly knew him, but I wrote a poem about, I've always noticed you seem to be a gentle person, something like that. It wasn't really long, and she gave it to him. And the next day after class, he said, can I talk to you? And he has tears streaming down his face. He said, I was planning to take my life last night, and your poem kept me from doing it. And he developed a friendship with this girl, and he came through all of that, and he's alive and well. She said, it's so amazing that a work of art can touch someone in a way that is often very, almost mysterious, really, because I think it comes from a very special place, the desire to share and connect from the heart, as the saying says. Garth Brooks was asked what the value of country music was, and without a doubt, he does this. He says, it comes from right here. It comes from right here. And so we talk about putting hearts in tune, as you were saying, through entrainment. That's another way of putting hearts in tune with story, with connection, with references to being coal miners' daughters. That stuff is great because all of us share some history of some sort where there's been some brokenness in all of our lives. There's not a person here who is alive who hasn't had some loss in their lives. And the fact that that loss can actually be a place where we connect to share is a very powerful thing. And then we suddenly think of what someone like Kathy Kollwitz or Millicent Becker did by creating a body of work that monumentalized life in all of its complexity, even its tragic beauty. And that's a phrase that's often used in art that often people don't hear about. We know about beauty of flowers and so on, but there's also tragic beauty that allows us to see into and through very difficult, troubling times, to survive a war, for instance. Yeah.
Your book started me on a journey about 3 years ago of appreciation and research on Van Gogh. And, you know, history had always showed that Van Gogh took his own life by shooting himself and so forth. The latest movies, Loving Van Gogh, or Loving Vincent and Eternity's Gate, have now turned the tables now saying that the children actually shot him and killed him. Any feeling on that or comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's possible. What people often don't know, in fact, when I revise my book, I'd like to get another shot at it, make some changes in there. I'm going to bring this up. I didn't know that at the time that I wrote my book in 2010, but later in 2010, there was a second book that was released after mine called Van Gogh, the Life. And although I have my issues with that book for a lot of reasons, there are several things in the book that are very important. And one is a mention of the fact that in 1930, John Rewald, a very important art historian, he's now passed away, actually went to Auvers and interviewed people who were then in their 60s or so, who had been in that town when Van Gogh died in 1890. These were older people, but they had good memories of what happened during that time. And many of them said that there were young boys who had a pistol and so on. Well, that was John Rewald's a record of it. He kept a record of these interviews and made notes that Van Gogh may have been accidentally shot as early as 1930. Then in the 1990s, a letter was found by a gentleman who claimed to have actually been one of the boys. It was a confessional letter, And he said that he and some of his friends had a pistol, and a very unfortunate thing happened. He didn't admit shooting him, but it was all but a confession. And Van Gogh, when he was actually dying, was being interviewed by a local policeman, a constable. And Van Gogh said, "I've been shot, don't look for anyone else," which is a very strange thing. And I'll just leave you with this last one. Having done years of research on Van Gogh's letters, I know them very intimately. I know all of them. I've read them again and again. There were 2 times in his life he took the blame for other people. There was something very curious about his willingness to do this. And I think it's entirely possible he didn't want these boys to get in trouble, and he also knew that he was critically ill. I think I have to stop because there's another group coming in here. Anyway, I do hope you'll look at the book and know that you'll be supporting the Endangered Children's Foundation. Thank you all. It's been a great day.